And we're live. Great. Well, Lindsay, welcome. And I'm so excited to get to meet you. And I've followed your work for a few years now, thinking a lot about, brain retraining, and this idea about how our bodies are expressing some kind of emotional experience often, and how we can kind of understand that. And then also some of the ways that our understanding, let's say, of emotion or our bodies or even illness or pain have been pretty limited. And I was kind of fascinated about some of your journey, and I wanted to kind of hear a little bit about just, I don't know, first if you could introduce yourself, but I'm kind of curious as we're talking about kind of hearing some of your path, your journey of kind of exploring those things. But yeah, welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me. This is a subject that is so near and dear to my heart. And, I'm sure you see it in your practice all the time of like, we have this idea that we, experience trauma psychologically, but we don't really think about how we experience trauma physically and how the body internalizes trauma and how the body doesn't really distinguish between traumas, psychological trauma, physical trauma, an illness, a car accident, and it's such an interesting concept. So I love to bring that to my work that I teach in my company, Vital Side. And so my background is I'm a physician assistant. That's what I'm trained in. And, started working in internal medicine and then had my own experience with a chronic illness, which led me down multiple routes, like starting with the kind of Western medicine route, what I knew. And I quickly saw that I wasn't getting better. And that's when I came across this information about the brain's connection to the body and how when we're able to optimize that connection, we can set our bodies up to heal. So that's what I teach in Vital Side today. And I've been doing this, since 2018. It's been such a cool process. But a little bit deeper into my story, I got that diagnosis of chronic Lyme disease. And it's such like a hefty, weighted diagnosis when you get one of these ones that you go online to search and there's people who have been living with this for 10, 20, 50 years.
Wow.
And it's like the migraines and the anxiety and the joint pain and these symptoms that I had never experienced before but started to experience very quickly over a period of months. And it started with a tick bite and then rapidly turned into this like sensitivities to food and to smells and to my environment and anxiety and joint pain. I do want to say that though I did get that tick bite and that diagnosis of Lyme, that was really kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. There was, we have so much capacity for things, and that just kind of tipped me over. So what I mean by that is, I've experienced a lot of psychological trauma in my life, and I experienced a compromised immune system as a result of those things, and then also diagnosed with Epstein-Barr as a kid. And so I kind of had this buildup of trauma, we'll use that generalized term of physical, psychological, emotional, mental stress and trauma. And then I got that tick bite and my body was like, nope, can't do this anymore, and really went into that overdrive hyper-inflammatory response.
Yeah, so it's like the tick bite it's like the dam was full of water, and it was like that was like the thing that cascaded it over and caused a catastrophe in your body where it was basically responding and saying, I can't take this anymore. And there's something that can feel overwhelming about that, I'm sure, or depressing, hopeless, especially when you think about like a Western medicine approach where they're treating symptoms maybe. And then but there's something else going on there too. Tell me if this is a little bit about how you've made sense of this behind the scenes for yourself, but is that there was something about that where, your body was crying out and saying, I actually need something. I need some kind of care. I need to be recognizing what's going on, or I need to be taking care in some way about what's happened for me, as opposed to I just need to take care of the symptoms. I need to make be sensitive about foods, or I need to do all these other things. Is that something close to what it felt like?
Totally. And I don't think it was, until later down the road when I realized that, because at first, as a practitioner and having this medical mind of okay, well, if it's Lyme disease, I've got to treat with antibiotic, and okay, there's co-infection of parasites, I got to treat with antiparasitics, and I very quickly realized that wasn't the route that was going to help, because at the time I was a very 0 to 100 person. So meaning I was going to put 100% of my effort into healing, and that meant trying everything all at once, opening the water faucet and just letting it rain down on me. And, for good reason, because when we are very sick and our body does give out in that way, we want to try everything to see if that would help. And I had a grant at the time for Lyme disease, so I was able to kind of financially, try these different modalities, and quickly saw that there was this neglect that I had, for taking care of my body, which is very easy to do when our bodies are functioning well, right? We kind of take that for granted, and we think, okay, I was working as a travel PA. I was doing a lot of travel. I spent time in South America. I was exposed to different living situations with water damage, and, got a GI bug, for a month. And I didn't really think anything of it, right? But then when we have something that, really catastrophic in our lives, we try to take the dots and connect the pieces and say, okay, when did this happen? And I started to do that and noticed that pattern of neglect. And with that, I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I was doing that, but I didn't have that awareness of the need to really take care of my body. I mean, at the time, I was in my 20s. I was like, I'm pretty healthy, right? Things are pretty good. I'm eating a, okay diet and all of these things. But I wasn't prioritizing certain things in my life, one being my physical well-being. And I say that, and I don't also have that expectation that really anyone would when they don't have that experience. So I also am very understanding that that's pretty normal for so many of us. And if we're kind of living, doing our lives, engaged in our lives, kind of distracted, we tend to live that way. So yeah, that was a very eye-opening thing for me. And then when I got that diagnosis, and, started researching it, I went to grad school on the East Coast. I knew about Lyme, but it was a very kind of limited view on it and how it should be treated and the prognosis. I didn't know that much about chronic Lyme. So when I started to do the research and kind of find these, forums of people who had been living with this for decades, that's when I started to kind of feel that panic rise of, oh no, will I have to live with this forever? That kind of depression sets in.
Yeah.
And the anxiety I equate mostly to the hypervigilance I was experiencing as a result of being in that chronic state of stress, just kind of fighting that bacterial infection every day. But I really did start to feel that kind of sense of, impending doom of maybe this is a life sentence for me. And it was really frustrating.
So, and yeah, I can understand that of just going like, what if this doesn't go away? I have two friends who have IBS issues chronically, and I think about that for them. Of they just go, I guess this is the managing of this symptom is just what my life is going to look like now, forever. And there's something I think that feels familiar about that with what you said about almost kind of like the trauma had been the water that you had been living in. And I think that's true for a lot of us when we grow up, like when you said you're in your 20s and you're just doing things like you might normally do, of the kind of the water that you live in becomes just your reality. And there's something that's actually, I think, even strong about us that we can go, I'm just going to make this work in this environment. But there comes a point where something switches and you go, maybe there's a possibility of opening something up and living my life outside of this, and that might require a lot of courage to take that step, or to shift my perspective and to try to open something up more inside of me for having a life that's a little bit more regulated or safe, or that I can do something more than I thought I could. But I'm kind of curious for you, of like, having been in the Western medicine, of what was that first shift for you, that because you went through this kind of depressive thing of this is just going to be my everyday life forever, maybe. And then it sounds like maybe something opened up for you. And I don't know if there was like an experience that you had or something that helped you to pull outside of that moment or to see something from a different perspective. What was that like?
It probably wasn't the healthiest way to go about things, but I really was a bit stubborn and I wanted to prove everyone wrong. And of course, that's something where you can, again, kind of connect the dots of tracing that back to childhood trauma of, really wanting to tell the practitioners that I had seen, that I wasn't going to live with this forever, that this wasn't going to become me and consume my entire life. And that's what I kept getting. So having started down the Western medical route and then kind of quickly shifting to more of an integrative approach, even with the integrative docs, it was difficult because there is this sort of like throw everything at this diagnosis, and we're not really sure. Hopefully one thing will stick. And what they really wanted to kind of try and convince me of was that this is something that you are going to have to live with, and so you have to learn how to do that. So my kind of stubbornness, or I guess independence, or whatever you want to call it, said, no, like, I'm not going to adopt this belief that I will have to live this way forever. And I'm going to continue to, try different things and seek first, but I will find something that is going to be the thing that gets me better. So that's kind of getting told no and wanting to prove the naysayers wrong was really important to me. And luckily I did have support. My husband was there. He was really advocating for me as well too. And he knew me, he knew who I was. And I felt that the practitioners that I was seeing were seeing one version of me that they thought was maybe the only thing. I'm not sure what they thought, right? But this is my thinking, my perspective at the time was like, oh, okay, well, this is who she is. And I didn't want them to think that. And, I had been told time and time again, well, this is something you're going to have to live with. You're a female in your 20s. Maybe your hormones will just regulate on their own. Just kind of these broad statements that really weren't individualized to me. And I thought, no, like I really did. I closed the tabs on the forums of people who had lived this way for a really long time. And I decided right then and there that I wasn't going to take on this diagnosis and make it a personality trait. And I do think that was vital to my recovery. It's not really the approach that I would suggest, recommend, but it worked for me. I do think there's a level of accepting that needs to happen of where you are in this moment and what your body is going through. But I don't believe that you do have to take on this, diagnosis as part of you. It can be something you're experiencing, absolutely, but it's not who I am. And that was really what I strived to hold on to, even during, the darkest moments.
Yeah. Okay, so you kind of push back, with this kind of force from inside of you of going, I can't just accept that this is going to be, what my life looks like. It's funny because that's actually like a paradoxical technique. For example, if you want to have somebody stop stuttering when they speak, you tell them to stutter and they'll go, and they'll try to, and they won't be able to. There's like a paradoxical thing that happens. But it's funny to me that like doctors, not that they were meaning to do this, but saying, well, this is just going to be your life, ends up being the thing that makes you kind of rage inside and go like, no, I can't take that,
Mm-hmm.
And there maybe is a hidden gift in that of them telling you this is how it's going to be, and helping to see the depressive horizon stretch out in front of you for your entire life, that makes you go, wait a second, I can't, my life is too valuable to me. I can't afford to live like that into my 50s, 60s, whatever else it is, that made you kind of feel connected to that. And then what was okay, so then you feel that and you go, I want to prove them wrong. Where did you go? Or what was the shift that you made? How did you first go, okay, how do I see this from a different perspective? Because it seems like your perspective now is very well honed in with a different kind of worldview about what it means to have a body, what it means to have an emotional experience, what it means to be in the world, what trauma means. All these things, from my understanding of you, seem pretty coherent around a different worldview. But what was the first shift that you made that helped you to see things from a different perspective?
I think it was realizing that my training had caused me to look kind of so narrow-mindedly at this prognosis and diagnosis and treatment plan. And I did have to have almost that kind of like conscious stepping back of I need to broaden my horizons. And it's funny because I think that's natural to me in general. But again, I had only lived so much life that I hadn't had like one of these really major experiences where I did need to take a step back. There were a few times in my life I can think about where I did have to reevaluate. So maybe it wasn't totally out of the norm for me to say, okay, wait a second, this path isn't really working for me right now. I'm not seeing the benefit, and I need to think about things in a broader perspective and know that there is a lot that I don't know.
Yeah.
And that caused me to seek. And I think a lot of us, those listening today are seekers. A lot of us are in that space of seeking when we are dealing with these chronic symptoms or more kind of ambiguous diagnoses. And it brought me to reading other people's stories and trying to understand them. So not quite the forums I was looking at, but healing stories. Like, what is it that people were using to make changes? So instead of trying to kind of like fix and wearing that hat, I was like, okay, I'm going to change things up and broaden my horizons when it comes to healing and maybe look at things from a new perspective.
Mm-hmm. And part of that perspective that I hear is the connection between something maybe more about your emotional regulation and your body's connection to these symptoms that can become inflamed. Am I hearing that right? Or what is that for you? How would you describe that?
Well, it was interesting because I started seeing a therapist when I got the diagnosis. And I think it was helpful. She was just a wonderful ear to listen to what I was going through and also give me some additional resources. But it wasn't something where I could use therapy to process past traumas because I was so in it. I was in fight or flight. every single day. So when I tried to kind of go down those routes, I had to stop because that would make me feel worse and just kind of exacerbate the inflammation I was experiencing. But she gave me a couple resources about, okay, like what if you did change your perspective, and what if you were able to take some deep breaths, and these things that seem so easy, simple to do now, but at the time I didn't really think about them. And so there was a book that she recommended. I think it's called it was something like a mindful take on self-compassion. And at the time, I wasn't really reading. Like, I couldn't read a ton because it was just really overwhelming. I wouldn't really remember things as a result of the symptoms I was experiencing. Yeah. But potentially, that was a catalyst for me to kind of sit down and say, oh, maybe there is that kind of emotional, feeling, reacting component. And that very well could have been the catalyst. I hadn't really thought about that before. But then that caused me to continue to seek tools that maybe were a little bit more geared towards the physical aspect, but had that component in mind. So then we're talking about the nervous system, right? And that's when I ran across a blog post online that, was someone who had gone through a chronic illness and had experienced her symptoms starting to dissipate. And she explained, like, very clearly, the brain and body have this constant communication. And when we're dealing with a chronic illness, our bodies are in that state of hypervigilance, hyperinflammation, fight, flight, or freeze, because we're reacting to the toxin, the parasite, the virus, the bacteria, like it is a danger, right? Like we hear that, example of the saber-toothed tiger, of something dangerous that we're running away from. But I had never heard it explained from the perspective of a physical, very something tangible that we can actually document on paper being the danger. And that really resonated with me, and then caused me to look at it from another perspective again of, look at my labs, look at what I'm doing for treatment. I really should be seeing the benefit of my treatments, but over here, I have no hormones, right? No hormonal production. My cortisol is so low. I'm, have all these inflammatory markers. Like, what is it? And it really made sense to me that there was this miscommunication going on. And despite the healing work that I was doing, it wasn't landing because my body was in that state of hyper-inflammation, hyper-reactivity. So it's as if I take a supplement, or, I take the thing that's meant to be a healing tool, and my body's like, nope, can't focus on that right now, focused on getting this bacteria, causing all of this inflammation, pain, and sensitivity so that you are aware. So doing its job, but there was this misalignment in communication. And that really gave me that, whoa, this is
so it's like
this is something to pay attention to.
Yes, and it's like even as I go to treat the symptom with the medication or whatever, it can be out of this fearful place in this freak out, just like a firefighter trying to put out a fire, where it's just panic, and that panic can be the state that ends up exacerbating the symptom that you're trying to treat by taking the supplement, let's say, or by doing the right thing. And the thing that you're kind of saying is that the most inflammatory thing isn't the Lyme disease itself, even though that's a trigger. It's the fear that we stay in. And it's so interesting to me how we have to keep coming up with new terms to talk about this mind-body connection. For example, to just say, oh, it's fear, there can be a temptation to dismiss it and go, what you're really saying is it's just in your head, and you have to calm down your emotion, and you're going to be okay. But that's not what you're saying. But then we have this term of, fight or flight, of like there's actually a state that your whole body is in when you are living in fear that's going to make everything more inflamed, everything more precarious, everything more fragile. For example, I think about, for example, IBS, where when you have chronic, high cortisol states, it's changing the blood flow in your stomach lining, in your gut lining, and it's creating more gaps so that you have more leaky gut, and it's going to cause more inflammation, making you much more susceptible to different foods being inflammatory. But if we only focus on the foods, we're in this cycle, right, of just trying to treat the symptoms or the outputs of the fear response. And when I hear that, that feels so soothing when I hear you talk about it, of treating the actual fears, paying attention to the fear that is behind the symptoms as a way to alleviate the body, to create safety, to create security there. I just think that is so important as we think about what it means to create health, less about, trying to address these different symptoms kind of neurotically, and more paying attention to the feeling behind it. The other part that I wanted to just comment on was just the feeling that you had initially of going, maybe when you heard in a blog or even from your therapist, of take deep breaths. You were so inflamed at that point that it was hard to even take in those moments because you were so scared about what was happening with your body or was overwhelming to you. And it is a difference, isn't it, of going, let's say somebody who's having a panic attack where all they can think about is the pain in their chest and that kind of attention that feels like it's focused on that, versus this idea about paying attention in a way that is opening up or broadening our attention, broadening our awareness, slowing ourselves down, paying attention to the pain in not an anxious way, but maybe a much more collected, caring, nurturing way. But I could hear that kind of tension of what it's like to try to address the symptom when you're so inflamed and it's hard to take in anything.
Yeah. And I think like a phrase that I like to use is physiological stress, or you can even say physiological fear. Because I think sometimes, even in that experience that you named of like, okay, I wasn't ready to go to that place of really understanding, like, or I guess addressing that symptom and getting to the place of feeling that in my body, because of that hyperinflammation and hyperreactivity. But it wasn't necessarily something I was conscious of, right? So I like that term physiological stress or physiological fear, because you don't have to be aware of it. It can be a cascade of hormonal responses in your body that are conditioned to respond with fear. So if you asked me at the time, are you scared, Lindsay? I may say no. No, I'm not scared. And potentially because there was that disconnection, right, between the mind and the body, but also because the body fear or stress was so much more potent than the mind, that became the thing that I was solely focused on, that my body was on that negative feedback loop of stress and fear. And so it's an interesting thing, but I hope that helps someone today who's like, well, I'm not anxious or I'm not afraid. And it's like, it doesn't have to even be mental. It can be physical. And that's why we have somatic work. That's why we have nervous system regulation work, is because it's not always mental. And you also mentioned IBS and you mentioned leaky gut. I'm curious if, for those listening and for you, if I can go a little bit deeper there, specifically focused on leaky gut, because I love that example and how that fear or that stress response, however you want to say it, is actually the root cause of that. And I can kind of walk through that process if that may be helpful today.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so when we have something like IBS, typically we blame a food, right? We are like, okay, well, these foods are inflammatory and this is causing the reaction. So what happens is the brain says this particular food is dangerous, and the body responds via this stress response of like, okay, this is dangerous. Now we need to bring out the big guns to respond in inflammation. And so we produce cortisol and then produce too much cortisol as a response to that danger. And cortisol is that basic stress hormone. And because we're producing it in response to stress, we run out and our adrenal glands become exhausted and the cortisol levels drop. So it's when we don't have enough cortisol levels to meet the demand that we start to feel unwell. And that's when we can start to feel maybe anxious or a little bit jittery or maybe tired, like tired during the day and not able to sleep at night. So then stress causes our mast cells to break down and release histamine all over the body, including the digestive system. And when histamine is released in the digestive system, this is that inflammatory reaction that we know as leaky gut, is this response to that initial potential danger. So when we have a leaky gut, the foods that we eat aren't broken down and digested properly. So a large protein molecule gets absorbed into the blood, which triggers an immune reaction. That's what happens when we have these kind of immune responses. And so a memory cell is then created. So the next time we eat that food, whatever that food was that we started out with, that our brains perceived as dangerous, our immune systems remember this and they say, ooh, this is that foreign protein, that creates that immune reaction. And our white blood cells come to help, right? Come to kind of rescue us and say, okay, like we need to respond. And because of that white blood cell production, those histamine releasing mast cells, then we get that food sensitivity and that shows up on a lab. And so this all started out because of that initial danger that our brain said this food is dangerous. And I want to say this could be as simple as someone on social media saying, gluten is bad for you. Don't eat gluten. It's harmful to you. And then has this whole, soapbox on gluten. That could be the danger that your brain is perceiving. So I just like to give that. Exactly.
The paired association that your brain is already making, even when you hear something about what the food is going to do to you, it creates a heightened cortisol response as you taste the food, to where your body, but also what you're saying is that, let's say your body had a certain reaction to a food for whatever reason initially, that it's going to create that association and perpetuate that association down the line, even if that food isn't actually dangerous to you, but you're stuck on a loop at that point, right? And there's a thing that your body's trying to do, which is to figure out how to cool down and to accept this food, let's say, and to not have a reaction, to know that it's safe again and it's okay. But even social media, these signals that we can get, whether it's mentally, whether it's through our gut, whether it's through our cortisol levels at the time, can create this association where we become incredibly sensitive to foods. And if we're only zeroed in on this narrow thing about this food is causing this pain, we miss the larger picture there. The example that I think of that I think speaks to this too, I'd have to validate this with actually hearing the actual report, but I heard this anecdotal thing from this, actually Zach Bush, I don't know if you follow him at all, but he mentions this incident of all these rabbits being given some kind of toxic food as a way to study toxicity in the development of tumors. And this one group of the rabbits who were given toxic food weren't developing tumors. And they kind of wondered, well, why was that? Why didn't those rabbits develop a tumor or an inflammation response, let's say, to this toxic food? is they're trying to figure out, because it was an anomaly, they should be growing tumors, but they're not. And they interviewed the guy who was actually taking care of those rabbits, and it was a different guy who was taking care of the rabbits. And they say, well, what do you, tell us exactly what you do when you take care of these rabbits. He goes, well, I feed them, and then I take each one of them out and I pet them. He goes, what? And you're like, well, I just love rabbits, and I just pet them and I put them back in their cage. And that safety response paired with the quote-unquote toxic food ameliorated their body's response of inflammation to the toxin. And I imagine what was happening is that it's a physiological change that the body is pairing with the food to where it's not freaking out. It has some kind of trust or sense of safety that's there with the food. And I think there's something like that of the shift that you're talking about that we all need, not just with foods, with our gut, right? IBS is a wonderful example because it's so clearly, it's such a clear, immediate response that can be traced back to a single source. But I think there's a larger lesson here of the things that we think are toxic have more to do with this fear response that is so hard to soothe sometime or pay attention to when we're just focused on the food. Or if we want to broaden it out to say, just focus on, for example, what it's like to go back and see family when this person has hurt you, or to go to a certain street when you had some kind of accident or traumatic thing happen there, or what it's like to go back to some kind of relational argument that you're having, and the body's response of terrible fear that can come up and overwhelm you and change everything about your physiology. And then we go, oh, that thing was toxic, instead of going, how do I soothe myself? How do I create larger safety in my life so that I can be resilient and strong, in the face of these things that life throws?
Absolutely. And to me, I think of this beautiful term of personal responsibility, and that can scare people, especially people who have, experienced massive stressors, caused from other people or events, or and they think, why me? And I get that. I have experienced that, from my own childhood trauma, and even from my own diagnosis of Lyme disease. And I did go through that to some degree. And I say personal responsibility is so beautiful because now it's I get to reframe what has happened to me. I get to understand my responses to those things. I get to then shift how I am going to respond. And so it does take healing into our own hands rather than allow the perpetrator or the event or the negative experience we had dictate how we physiologically feel. It's this process of brain retraining can allow you to feel about it from a totally different perspective, a totally different way. And really taking personal responsibility can be such the most empowering thing to do. And I certainly have seen that.
Yes. But when someone first hears that personal responsibility, they probably hear it differently. What do you think they hear it differently as when they first hear that versus what you mean?
Well, I think a lot of times they think, oh, I'm the one responsible for this thing, or I caused this thing to happen. Maybe I attracted this thing into my life, and or this thing happened and now I have to do something about it. And it's, a lot of that kind of victimhood that comes along with
they feel blamed, and then they push against it and they go, well, I don't want to be blamed, so it's actually not my responsibility, But then that gets them stuck in a different way, doesn't it? Of just going, well, I guess I'm powerless, and I guess I'm just managing symptoms, and poor me, which is kind of this diminishment of self, right? But I hear you saying it obviously in a different way, of this more maybe empowering, or even the term that comes to my mind is nurturing. It's my responsibility to nurture and care for this situation, for myself in some way. Or how would you describe that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great description. And I get to take care of myself. And one thing that also I have loved about personal responsibility is I'm solely responsible for myself. self. And that to me is amazing. And for those who are, relate to being an empath or think that they need to be in charge of like everyone else's happiness for some, to some degree, it's like personal responsibility. That means that I get to choose how I respond, not how anyone else responds. And even, I have a 6-month-old son, and I'm like, I'm not even responsible for how he responds. Like, I can be helpful in nurturing him and, taking care of him, but I'm not responsible for his happiness. And there is something so, like, a weight of like relief, like, of like, like that's not up to me. And it is, and that's why I say it is so beautiful, because then all of a sudden this like bubble that surrounds us of like, if you reach your arms out, in front of you and above you and to the sides and kind of behind you, like this is the bubble that you're in, and that's your personal responsibility, nothing else. And so it can feel like a relief, and it can feel really empowering, and you can feel really resilient as a result.
Yeah, you said a relief, like a sigh. I picture that sigh as like an expansion, this expansion of yourself. I'm not actually limited. I'm not actually small. I think this is the opposite, isn't it? It's just beautiful to think about that journey to go from pain and Lyme disease, of this feeling of what trauma has done to me, is it has put blinders on who I am. It's reduced my capacity to see all that I am, all of what I have to offer the world and myself, and all that I can hold, all that I can be aware of. It reduces our awareness. And then there's this catastrophic moment where it becomes too much, the dam overflows, right? And I think there's a gift in that, of the pain, where it becomes enough to where you go, I can't stand this toxic water. I can't stand being like this. And then you're describing this pathway where you learn through the pain to open up to something larger. And I think there is these two paths that we can choose. One is this pain management kind of path that's kind of symbolized in Western medicine, of this, just take care of the symptoms, that's all you can do. It can feel kind of depressive or limiting. And then this other one that is opening yourself up, moving through the pain into something greater. And that's what I hear you kind of coaching people through. How would you describe how you've come to see those signals of pain, whether it's in yourself or other people that you coach, of what is actually happening for them when they are going through a pain like panic attacks or IBS or pain or those kinds of things? What have you come to in terms of how you see those pain signals and what they mean?
Yeah. I phrase it as, warning signals that are there to protect us, really. So they're protective kind of mechanisms that make themselves apparent in order to keep us alive. And the thing about that is, like, sometimes we can take that and say, like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Oh, okay, like, that means that this food is bad, right? And my body's trying to protect me. And the kind of caveat to that is there can be this kind of misfiring and miswiring going on between the brain and the body that is saying, okay, but this food is dangerous, but that's just based on past experiences, and that's just based on like that whole cycle of that immune response that I have had. So there's this recognition of, one, this is a protective response trying to keep me alive. And two, I don't have to believe every single protective response is a result of something dangerous, because when you learn about the responses, you start to understand that they are responses that occur as a result of life experiences. And so if something, you mentioned like, okay, something dangerous happened in this place, like in a park, it doesn't mean that the park is dangerous. It just means that I have this perception of danger at the park. So, okay, knowing that, you can ask yourself, like, is this actual danger? Like, is this that saber-toothed tiger, or is this a result of this misfiring going on in my brain as a form of protection. And that's when limbic retraining can be extremely powerful to say, wait, no, that's my body's response to danger. It's not dangerous itself. And so knowing that, it's like it opens your mind up to like this whole world of different reactions that you can have, and actually saying, okay, well, what reaction do I choose to have? What would I rather have? And I liked the example of food because I love working with people with food, because many times people have really positive experiences with food, and not all the time, especially people who have experienced eating disorders and right. diagnoses like that. But, you may have a good memory associated to Christmas dinner, or maybe culturally you love to eat like big meals with your family and extended family members, and you have these really positive associations, but your body is making this association to this food as dangerous. So it's kind of cool because you bring that, the physiological stress response or fear response into play, and you bring kind of that protection online, physiologically, to match that of what's going on mentally. And that can be like a really, really incredible experience. So I think that's kind of, that's kind of how I would phrase it nowadays.
Right. And so tell me a bit about kind of the offerings that you guys have, or because you've built this community around helping people go through a similar pathway that you've walked there that has been transformative for you. Tell me about that process. Let's say there's a person who's interested, who wants to do that, go on that journey and heal that way. What are the things that you take them through in your offerings?
Yeah. What I offer, it's limbic brain retraining, which can sound really scary at first because you're like, what do you mean brain retraining? What are you going to cause my brain to do? And it is nothing to do with what it sounds like. We are literally all retraining our brains all the time, just the different content we consume and the things that we learn, or the things we don't pay attention to. All of this trains our brains. So it's being very, very conscious about how we are retraining our brains. So it's kind of like the example I just gave of, okay, understanding that my body is experiencing these protective mechanisms as a result of past experiences, and my emotional, feeling, reacting brain, that limbic brain, is online. And so it's this process of limbic brain retraining, of calming that feeling, hyper-inflammatory, hyper-reactionary response in association to the things that you like, to the things that you want to do again. So the food you want to eat, the activity you want to do, maybe it's exercise and you haven't been able to exercise. Maybe it's, talking to that person that you haven't avoided talking to that person, traveling, all of these things. It's, we can train to do those things again by calming that limbic response and consciously choosing your reactions through a series of protocols. So it's kind of like first learning the science behind how the brain changes, learning to do it yourself through structured daily practices, and then breaking up that pattern of chronic stress or chronic fear, psychological or physiological fear, however you want to name it. There are so many synonyms for that, and breaking that pattern up throughout the day. And a lot of that is through releasing feel-good neurochemicals throughout the day, and structurally kind of doing it to add to your daily routine. Because when we're in that chronic fear, in that chronic fight or flight or stress response, we're not able to release the serotonin or oxytocin or dopamine effectively because of that chronic production of those fear hormones. And so we're breaking that pattern throughout the day. Wow. So it is a bit of this structured process. It can be kind of all consuming, but it gets to be really fun and really empowering. And when you start to do it, you're like, I actually, I do have this personal responsibility, but it can be so cool because I get to do the things I want to do again and be that person and, connect and align myself to my most authentic self. And so it's really about you getting to choose that person and who you want to be. So it's a really, really very cool process.
That's beautiful. And the way you're talking about that, it's almost like, well, the supplement you need to take is care, nurture, calm throughout the day. And to me as a psychologist, how I hear that is what you're simulating there is secure attachment. You're simulating the experience of what it's like to be a kid and to bump into a world that's scary and to always be able to run back to mom or dad when you're scared and to have some kind of calm, secure presence. And when parents do that for kids as they grow up, no matter what they face, no matter what is scary to them or overwhelming, whether it's a skinned knee or a friend rejecting them or whatever else it is, it builds in them this memory that they carry with them throughout their life of, I'm okay, I'm safe, no matter what happens, I can return internally to this channel of care, nurturing that is there for me. And I hear you simulating that in this brain retraining of what you really need is to come back to a secure place inside of yourself and know that you're okay, no matter what the toxin is that's out there that feels scary to you. I think that's beautiful. And I kind of wonder, as we're kind of, I guess I want to be cautious of your time here, but I'm kind of wondering if you picture that person who is kind of like you were, who had Lyme disease, who when you were hearing those things from your therapist, you felt so inflamed and scared that all you could see was right in front of you. If you could picture speaking to that person of what you would want to tell them about what's ahead for them or what you want for them, what would you say?
First of all, what you're experiencing is a normal response to danger. Is this your body's way of trying to work for you? It is a bit misinformed right now, thinking that so many things in your life are dangerous, that food is dangerous, that person is dangerous, that smell or that activity is dangerous. But it's a result of these experiences in your life that have culminated and basically brought you to this point of your protective responses thinking so many things are dangerous. Number one, that's normal. And number two, start to become aware of it. And know that it doesn't mean that you have to live this way forever. It simply means that you can have this understanding, this acceptance of what's going on, and then start to make small, daily changes to your perception of this protective mechanism. And you can do so in these real bite-sized, small little pieces. And when you do, that's when you can start to reclaim your resilience. That's when you start to take that step to feeling more like yourself or a version of you that is yet to be created. But I think normalizing that first is the most important piece, because you can feel totally alone right now. But I've experienced something very similar, and so many people, thousands of people have as well. And understanding there's something you can do about it is really important. Yeah,
wow. What a great waypoint for a person, in that situation. I'm thinking about there's so much more room for that kind of voice in the middle of our pain of you're scared, but there's something new for you. It doesn't just have to be about symptom management or just depressively accepting what's in front of you. There's a broader horizon, for you. But yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And we'll link to you guys, and I love the offerings that you guys give with that community. And I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And for your listeners too, I am going to offer a free introductory course for people who are like, I'm kind of interested in brain retraining. And I will give you that link so that you can post it in the show notes. Awesome. And they can sign up and have a month free access to these 7 videos. They're all 7 minutes or less, very kind of simple to integrate into your day-to-day to start breaking that stress response, especially if you're one of those who are like, brain retraining sounds weird. This is a really, really great place to start. So that's called Reset, and I'll send you that link.
Awesome. Thank you. That's great. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.